Okay, so far we've seen that the stereotypical view of our two hemispheres is that the left does all these nasty things and that the right hemisphere does all of these nice things. What I'm going to focus on in the next few minutes is what's the evidence for this? Now, the idea that different functions can be localized to different parts of the brain is an old one. You've probably seen phrenological busts like this with sort of functions of the mind labelled out on various bits of the brain. And this was a very popular idea in the 19th century. And in fact, if you went for a job interview in the 19th century, you wouldn't have to fill out a personality questionnaire or the Minnesota multiphasic personality or 360, and none of that. Wouldn't have to get you to report on things because they could just measure your skull. And in fact, this was such big business that people were expected to bring their phrenological region along to job interviews to prove that they were suited to the job in question. And so phrenological institutes were set up doing these measurements, and they had such big business they automated it. So here we see Lavery's electrical automatic phrenolometer. And this machine full of cogs and things, you put this hat on the person. Clearly it's designed for men because the women have to stand in a box, so it doesn't actually adjust very well, but it whirs around, all the calipers go in and out, and it will measure all of your lobes and then spit out a report with various holes punched in boxes to indicate your fraternality, your progestiveness, your love of children, your filial duties and things like that. Not actually attributes that we recognise today as things that the brain does, but personality constructs. And the idea goes back a long way. And it comes from observations of people who had brain injuries. So, localization of speech, we've seen, is now known to be a left hemisphere function. But this is Jonathan Swift, who wrote Gulliver's Travels. Famous author, Dean Swift, it's called because he worked in Dublin. He had a stroke towards the end of his life, which actually removed his power of speech. He was completely aware that he'd lost this facility that was really one of the sort of hallmarks of his personality. And all he was able to say were these short, emotional exclamations, "Ah, a fool!" Because he couldn't talk anymore, he couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't express himself. Just very overlearnt, emotional phrases. And Franz Gall was a physician who treated a soldier who had had a sword wound just behind his left eye. It's sort of gone in there and damaged the brain just behind his left eye. And he similarly could not recall the names of things. He was unable to name familiar objects, and he'd say, Mr. So-and-so, the thingamajig, Mr. such-and-such. And Francis Gall was one of the founders of what became known as phrenology. And he attributed this damage to the organ of verbal memory, and said that bit of the brain does verbal memory. Because the soldier had it damaged, that's why he could no longer speak properly. And his student, Rio, that's his date, 1796 to 1881, quite a long time, he promised a prize of 500 francs to anyone who could produce a patient with a sort of left frontal lobe injury like that, who could still speak normally. And nobody could, so nobody won that prize. So this supported the phrenological argument about localization of function within the brain, and the fact that you could then measure people's abilities by measuring their skull. Now, we now know today that this area of the brain is in fact responsible for language, and it's not named after Gall, and it's not named after Guillaume. It's named after Broca. Because in 1861, he was working in a hospital in Paris. He met a patient called Le Borgne, who could only say very limited things. He could say, Sacre nom de Dieu, holy name of God, an emotional expression, just the sort of thing that Dean Swift could still say. And he'd say, tan. I'm not sure what that means in French. I know in Welsh it means fire, but I don't know if Le Borgne can speak much. Le Borgne died soon after this, and Broca did the post-mortem on him and found that, just as Gall and Guillaume had argued, his left frontal lobe had been destroyed, his organ of verbal memory. So he wrote that up. Presented it to the Academy of Sciences, and this area is now called Broca's area. It's named after him, because he wrote it up and did it scientifically, unlike the phrenologists, who were actually averse to cutting up animals and dogs and patients and things like that. So they would only work from external injuries that they could see. So we now know that the left hemisphere is specialised for language, and it's named that area after Broca. There's another area nearby, Wernicke. Together, they control a great deal of our speech output. And so if that's on the left-hand side of the brain, and in most people are being right-handed, their sort of gross motor control is in the left-hand side of the brain as well. Are these two things connected? If you get left-handed people whose gross motor control is in the right-hand side of their brain, does language shift over? Is lateralization of language linked to handedness? And the brain just reverses like that? Well, the answer is no. And here's a study from 2000, next, where they tested a huge number of people that are represented on this graph, and the height of all of these little columns indicates people, number of people. And it's a three-dimensional graph, so there are actually three axes here. We've got handedness going from left to right, and we've got language ability going from left to right. And at the top here, we've got the number of people. So what they did was they gave some tests to people to see how handed they were, whether they were left-handed or very right-handed. And then they gave them some language tests to see, they flashed up words on the screen like we saw in the experiments with Sperriefeld, to see whether their language was lateralized on the left or the right-hand side of their brain. And as you can see now, when we count people, well, most people have language on the left. Very few people have language on the right. They've got a large number of left-handed people. There's only about 10% of the population. But they wanted to find out about left-handedness and right-handedness, so they went and purposely selected a roughly equal number of left-handers and right-handers. So you can see that overall they're fairly equal. But there's hardly anybody in this group who are right-handed and have language on the right-hand side of their brain. Exceptionally rare. And in fact, those columns are probably sort of just one or two people. And you see they're all quite close to the midline. So it might be that the language test there is saying actually their language is in both hemispheres, not strongly right brain. Now if you look at the left-handed people, well, there's more people with language being in the right, but again, it's one or two strong, maybe a few more towards the midline, and then most have their language in the left hemisphere, just like the right-handed people. And in fact, overall, we find about 95% of right-handed people have language in the left-hand side of their brain. So both their motor control and language is controlled by the same hemisphere. And 75% of left-handed people whose motor control is in the right hemisphere have their speech still in the left hemisphere. So it's not that your brain flips over if you're left-handed. It's just the motor control. Half of the others aren't biased, and in the general population, only 2 to 4% of people have sort of got their brains flipped over with language in the right-hand side of their brain. For 96 to 98% of people, language is a left hemisphere function.